This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review with Gilad Halpern.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, a program dedicated to the word, to the thought and to debate. I'm your host, Gilad Halpern, and every week I'll be engaging in close encounters of the intellectual kind, with writers and scholars, or just people of ideas of all types and vocations who have done something to make our lives a tad more interesting. My guest today is a history professor and director of Jewish Studies at Bard College in the United States. She is also the author of a new book entitled YIVO and the Making of Modern Jewish Culture, Scholarship for the Yiddish Nation, that was recently published by Cambridge University Press. It tells the story of YIVO, a Yiddish acronym that stands for Yiddischer Wissenschaftlicher Institute, or the Yiddish Scientific Institute, from its foundation in Eastern Europe exactly 90 years ago. Dr. Cecile Kuznitz, welcome to the Tel Aviv Review.
Thank you very much.
So when YIVO was founded in 1925 in Eastern Europe, what was its mission and mandate? What did it seek to achieve?
Well, YIVO was the first institution founded to focus on scholarly research about the history and culture of Yiddish-speaking Jews, primarily in Eastern Europe, but also in all of the immigrant communities they had created in North America and Palestine and so forth. And it was also envisioned as the first institution that would publish scholarly work in Yiddish as well as about Yiddish-speaking Jewry. And so part of its mission was to raise the prestige of the Yiddish language, which traditionally had a low status in Jewish culture, compared to Hebrew or later compared to European languages, to research the history of the language itself, to standardize it, and to serve as an authority that could set rules for the language that would help to win respect for the language and the culture around Yiddish, and by implication for all of Yiddish-speaking Jews.
Mm-hmm.
So YIVO saw itself as an academy for the Yiddish language, but also as a national library that would gather material on the history and culture of these Jewish communities so that students and scholars could have access to it, that would carry out research and publish its findings, and also to train young scholars to serve as the equivalent of a Yiddish university.
What was the backdrop against which it was set up? Did it try to address any needs, any sociological, any community needs?
Yes, well, what I just described was narrowly defined its scholarly mission, but it also saw itself as playing an important role in the wider Jewish community. It described its overall mission as serving the folk, serving ordinary Jews. And it saw itself as being able to do this because it was created in the context of Jewish nationalism in Eastern Europe, when, as I'm sure you're familiar, in the late 19th century, there are various varieties of national movements that became very popular in Central and Eastern Europe, and Jews were no exception. They also had their own national movements, and the most well-known of these is Zionism, which sought to revive Hebrew as a spoken language and to create a Jewish homeland. But there was also a variety of Jewish nationalism known as diaspora nationalism that sought to strengthen the rights of Jews in the diaspora, particularly in Europe, in the countries where they were currently living, and to help develop a modern, largely secular culture in the Yiddish language, which was the vernacular language of most Jews in Eastern Europe.
So YIVO was set up to serve, to give some kind of intellectual or ideological impetus to diaspora nationalism?
Yes, so YIVO saw itself as an institution that by researching the language and culture of Jews in the diaspora would help strengthen their claims to being a national group among many national groups in Eastern Europe, and this would help win respect for Jews in the diaspora and also help win them political rights to be recognized as a national minority. So it had this larger political and cultural function, particularly in the period when YIVO was founded after the First World War in 1925, when there was a series of minority treaties put into place in the region in the wake of the First World War. And these treaties specified that newly formed states would have to support the languages and cultures of their national minorities. And even though in practice these treaties were usually not enforced, this gave hope to Jews in Eastern Europe that this would create a setting where they could work to build cultural institutions in the countries of Eastern Europe that would have support and that would be recognized by the government.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned that it was alongside Zionism. Was it in competition with Zionism? Was it in competition with the Hebrew academies that proliferated in Eastern Europe during the same time, more or less?
Well, interestingly, the Hebrew University in Jerusalem was founded just a few months prior to YIVO's founding in 1925. And also, at the same time, there were government-supported academies for Jewish research that were created in the Soviet Union. So in a certain sense, YIVO was offering one model of Jewish scholarship that was alongside the Zionist model of put forth by the founders of Hebrew University, as well as Jewish communists in the Soviet Union. So in a certain sense, YIVO was in competition with Zionism. Certainly it had its critics who accused YIVO of being anti-Zionist and focusing on Yiddish to the exclusion of Hebrew. The leaders of YIVO never saw themselves that way. They always said that they were interested in researching all of Jewish culture and all of its many languages and manifestations. And in fact, it did carry out research not only on Yiddish-speaking communities, but on Mizrahi communities, communities in North and South America, etc.
But its focus
really was on
Cecile,
Yiddish language and on Yiddish-speaking communities.
But wouldn't you say that the political implications of YIVO, as you just described, are mutually exclusive with the ultimate goal of Zionism? Even if they didn't say they were anti-Zionist, weren't they anti-Zionist by implication?
Well, I wouldn't say they were anti-Zionist. They didn't work against Zionism, or they didn't actively oppose the creation of a Jewish homeland. But they felt, most of the founders felt, that it was more urgent to work on behalf of Jewish rights in the countries of Eastern Europe. So in that sense, they did present a kind of alternate model where instead of advocating emigration from Eastern Europe in the 1920s and 30s as conditions became more difficult for Jews in Europe, most of YIVO's founders were interested in finding ways to strengthen Jewish life and work for Jewish rights in the diaspora. Now, there were also several supporters of Zionism who were among YIVO's founders and scholars and so forth, so it wasn't necessarily in opposition. There were Zionist figures who also collaborated in YIVO's work. But in general, most of YIVO's founders were more focused on what was called in Yiddish doekite, or here-ness, focusing on the here and now, which meant work in Europe rather than working to build up the Jewish homeland in Palestine.
And they didn't see it as contradicting the concept of, making aliyah, of leaving Eastern Europe for Israel, and neither do you.
Well, particularly in the 1930s, as economic and political conditions worsened in Europe, there was a very heated debate among Jewish leaders and ordinary Jews as well about how to address these challenges that Jews faced. So there were some people who really focused on emigration to the land of Israel as one possible option. And YIVO's economic statistical section, which was one of its four main scholarly sections, actually created a new journal in the late 1930s specifically to focus on questions of employment and emigration, trying to address these questions of where could Jews find work, where could Jews settle in new communities. And so Zionism and Aliyah was seen as one option, obviously, for Jews, but unlike Zionists who focused exclusively on that as the solution to the Jewish problem, as it was sometimes described, diaspora nationalists, as I said, focused more on a range of options that Jews might pursue as a way of alleviating their situation.
Yeah, in the 1920s and 1930s, things weren't great for Jews in Eastern Europe, and of course it got even worse as time progressed. And you said that YIVO was set up in the wake of the Minority Protection Treaty that inspired many Jews with optimism. Did it dissipate over the years? Do you see like a decline of the optimism that was there in the beginning?
Yes, I think it did. I think in the early 1920s, when YIVO was founded, it established its headquarters in the city of Vilna, which in that period was part of Poland. Today it's known as Vilnius, and it's the capital of Lithuania. But when YIVO established its headquarters in Vilna, the Polish government was legally obligated by international treaties to support schools and cultural work in the languages of its national minorities, which in the case of Jews meant the Yiddish language. And this gave great optimism to the founders of YIVO. But as I mentioned, it quickly became apparent that the Polish government was not going to carry out its treaty obligations. So this sense of optimism gave way to the realization that it would be very difficult to finance an institution like YIVO without government support, and this was one of the problems that YIVO always struggled with, where to get sufficient funding. And then by the 1930s, the economic situation became much worse when the economic crash that began on Wall Street reached Europe, and then, of course, after 1933, with the rise of Hitler and the rise of right-wing movements in Poland in the mid-1930s, the political situation got increasingly worrisome. So YIVO did feel itself under increasing pressure on how to deal with the economic and the political situation, and there were some elements within YIVO as well as critics outside of YIVO who always pushed the institution to be more political and to take an explicit political stance given the difficult conditions of the day. But the majority
such as
of
what? Anti-Nazi or anti-nationalist or what?
Well, really the question was YIVO supporters were overwhelmingly drawn from the left, meaning ranging from liberal to communist, let's say. And there were some elements who within YIVO's leadership and supporters who were socialists. They were members of one of the two most popular Jewish socialist political parties, the Bund, which was a diaspora nationalist party, and not advocating for Aliyah, but advocating for Jewish rights in the diaspora, or the left wing of the Poale Zion party, which was both Zionist and diaspora nationalist, so to speak. It balanced work in the diaspora with its Zionist principles. So there were some elements within YIVO who thought that the Institute should affiliate essentially with the socialist movement. And this became more pressing in the 1930s with the formation of the Popular Front and so forth, with the sense that that the left should unite together with the Soviet Union in the fight against fascism. So really the political pressure on YIVO was to openly affiliate not with a particular political party, but with socialism as a movement. But the majority of YIVO's leaders, even though many of them were sympathetic to socialism and were certainly on the left politically, felt that the Institute's mission was really to be devoted to scholarship, to academic work, and then in order to maintain its objectivity and also to represent the folk, to represent a broad stratum of Jews, it should avoid taking any explicit political positions.
And then comes 1939 and the onset of the Second World War, when it becomes almost impossible to live as a Jew in Eastern Europe, quite literally. What happens to YIVO then?
Well, the history of YIVO during this period is very dramatic and very complex. YIVO's established its headquarters in Vilna, but it was always envisioned as an institution with branches throughout the world, and a branch in New York had been established also in 1925. So in 1940, the New York branch becomes originally the temporary, eventually the permanent headquarters of YIVO. Originally it's envisioned as just a temporary measure during the duration of the war. The Soviets invade Vilna, then they leave, then they come back. So for about a year, YIVO continues to operate as part of Soviet Lithuania, when it does continue its work, even though the war is already in progress. But then a year later, the Nazis invade. And once the Nazis come in, they turn the YIVO headquarters building into a sorting center for looted Jewish cultural property. So the YIVO collections themselves, as well as other collections that are brought there, the Nazis want to sort through this material save what they consider the most valuable and send it to Germany for a museum that they planned to establish after they had annihilated the Jewish people, a museum of the so-called extinct Jewish race. And the vast majority of this material they wanted to destroy.
Mm-hmm. So would you say that the bulk of the work that had been done at YIVO up until the Second World War was lost?
Well, a large part of it was destroyed by the Nazis. Ironically, the material that was shipped to Germany, what the Nazis wanted to save, that was recovered after the war. Some of the workers who were forced as slave laborers under the Nazis to sort the material did their best to rescue some of these documents at the risk of their lives, and a small amount of material was saved that way and recovered after the war. But it was believed that everything else had been destroyed. The YIVO building itself was destroyed through bombing by the end of the war, and so anything that was remaining there had been destroyed. So it was only in the end of the Soviet period with perestroika that it became known that there was a significant amount of material that scholars had believed that the Soviets had destroyed in the post-war period that had survived just conditions of neglect, but it hadn't actually been destroyed by the Soviets in the post-war period, and that only came to light in the 1990s.
But during the Second World War, the center of gravity of YIVO becomes New York City, where it stays to this day. In the post-war period, how radically was YIVO's mandate and work changed? Because it is, after all, a new cultural environment, and of course, the whole geopolitical makeup of the world had changed radically. How did it affect YIVO's work?
Well, it did affect YIVO's work in a very fundamental way, because YIVO's original mission was really based around serving not just a small group of scholars, but really a mass audience of Yiddish-speaking Jews in the ways I've described. And it did have mass numbers of grassroots supporters that worked on the Institute's behalf prior to the Second World War. In the wake of the Holocaust, so much of that population is decimated that YIVO really no longer has this mass audience of Yiddish speakers on which to base its work. And so it has to adjust its mission in the United States. It still remains committed to the Yiddish language. It remains committed to documenting and presenting material on East European Jewry. But it also quickly turns its attention to documenting and researching the Holocaust. It becomes really the first center of Holocaust studies in the world, even before the creation of Yad Vashem in Israel. And it also turns its attention to American topics, to American Jewry, and really tries to ground itself in its new American setting. But the vision of YIVO as an institution really based on millions of Yiddish speakers, working on behalf of the rights and the culture of a mass audience of Yiddish speakers, it isn't really able to replicate in the United States for clear demographic reasons.
Mm-hmm. And was it marginalized in the Jewish world following that development?
Well, in the United States, the most important YIVO scholar, Max Weinreich, who was one of its leaders in Eastern Europe, is the only YIVO leader to survive the war, and he goes on to lead the institution in the United States. And Weinreich in the United States, as I said, remains committed to the vision of Yiddish scholarship and really tries to integrate YIVO into the American Jewish community and into the larger American academic community. He feels very strongly that in the United States, the legacy of Eastern Europe, the history of Jews in Europe is something that American Jews need to understand and that needs to be part of the larger academic scene. And he works very hard on behalf of this vision that he believes in very strongly. I would say he has some mixed success, and this is a period when most American Jews are moving away from Yiddish. They still associate it with their immigrant roots. And Jewish studies, as we see it today as an academic field, really doesn't exist in American universities. Mm-hmm. So ironically, it's really only decades later, I would say, that the larger American Jewish and American society comes to recognize the point that Weinreich was making in the 1940s and 50s, which is that in the United States, the legacy of East European Jewish culture is still very important and something that needs to be studied and recognized for Jews today to understand their own background.
So that brings me to my next question, which is, how central was YIVO in saving Jewish culture in the post-war period? How much more would have been lost had it not been for YIVO?
Well, YIVO today is the world's largest repository of material on Yiddish language and on East European Jewish history and culture. So its collections, which comprise what was saved from the pre-war period as well as much more material that was subsequently added to its collections, are extremely important for researchers and students. People come from all over the world to use the YIVO library and archives. And it was able to build these collections not only because of the material it was able to save from Vilna, but also because immediately, even while the Second World War was still going on, it recognized the importance of trying to save material, of getting people to document their experiences and send their memoirs to YIVO. And so it began collecting material on the Holocaust, as I said, even while the war was going on. When Yad Vashem was created in 1953, it contacts YIVO and asks YIVO to create a partnership because it realizes that YIVO already has a significant archive of material on the Holocaust. And YIVO recognizes at a very early point the importance of documenting and researching the Holocaust as well as gathering whatever material it still can on Eastern Europe and Jewish life in Eastern Europe. So I would say that YIVO is very important, really decades before other organizations began to see the importance of these topics on documenting and researching East European Jewish culture and Yiddish language and so forth. Mm-hmm. And even today, if I could add this in, YIVO is engaged in a project to preserve and to make accessible pieces of its collections that remain in Vilna and that only came to light in the 1990s with the fall of the Soviet Union. So even today, YIVO's collections are growing in a sense, and it's continuing to try to make this legacy of East European Jewish life available to the widest possible audience.
Mm-hmm. Okay, Dr. Cecile Kuznitz, I'm afraid this is all we have time for, so thank you very much for coming on the show today. You're a history professor and the director of Jewish Studies at Bard College and the author of a recently published book, YIVO and the Making of Modern Jewish Culture, Scholarship for the Yiddish Nation. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
בעוד שעה, בעוד שנה, יהיה שמח, אני תמיד חוזר על המנגינה,
That brings us to the end of our show today. Thank you very much for listening. Also, big thanks to Alex Benish, the technical producer of this show. I'm Gilad Halpern, signing off here in Tel Aviv. Do join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, goodbye.
לחיים אין מקום ביומן, רק נרים את הראש, נצליח לכבוש את הבלגן. דאגות עד מעל הצוואר, אני חי בתקופת מעבר, לא חשוב תאריך, אני תמיד מחכה למחר כאילו מה. בעוד שעה, בעוד שנה, יהיה שמח, אני תמיד חוזר על המנגינה. למה לא עכשיו? אני תמיד מוצא סיבות טובות לברוח. למה לא עכשיו? יפו עד אתונה, כל קריש או טונה, כולם רוצים אותו דבר. קמים כל יום בבוקר ומחכים לאושר בתור ארוך שלא נגמר. כן, יום אחת מחכה לדבר, אחד לתוספת שכר, ואני מחכה שהשחר יקה ודברים יסתדרו כבר לבד. סיבות תירוצים נימוקים וכולם מחכים ורק הזמן לא מחכה לאף אחד. בעוד שעה, בעוד שנה, יהיה שמח, אני תמיד חוזר על המנגינה. סילבסטר, אחרי הטיול בסוף המבול, אחרי שיגיעו תשובות מהטסטר, נצא מהמינוס, נצא את הנילוס. קודם אמצא לי דירה במרכז, אחרי שהוריד במשקל התוך יבוטל, אמצא עבודה, ואז אחרי שנקים משפחה תגיע ברכה, אחרי שנחתן את הילדים, אחרי שיבנו פה רכבת קלה ויהיה לי נדל"ן במרכז מאדים, עם כל הפחדים וכל השלדים, לקחת את הזמן כמובן מאליו, לפני שתרגיש שחייך עבור רק בדרך אגב.
למה לא עכשיו?